Most people think Joseph Smith built Mormonism. They are wrong. He started it. But the man who gave it an audience and the man who gave it a brain were two brothers most members today could not pick out of a lineup. Their names were Parley and Orson Pratt. One was a preacher so persuasive he could walk into a stranger's church and walk out with the entire congregation. The other was a self-taught philosopher who published the founding story of the religion before Joseph Smith himself bothered to. Between them, they converted thousands, wrote the books missionaries carried for decades, and built the intellectual framework the church still quietly relies on. And they were punished for it. By the end of this video, you will understand why some historians believe the Pratt brothers, not Joseph Smith, not Brigham Young, were the most important figures in the survival of early Mormonism. And you will see what the church did to them once they became inconvenient. Because the institution that owes its existence to these two men spent a century making sure you never learned their names. Part 1. The Hostile Takeover. Parley Parker Pratt was born in 1807 in Burlington, New York. He had no formal education, no connections, no money. What he had was a voice that could fill a room and a pen that could fill a pew. Before he ever heard of Joseph Smith, Parley was already a restless believer moving through Protestant denominations, searching for something that matched the Christianity he read in the New Testament. When he encountered the Book of Mormon in August of 1830, just months after the church's founding, he read it in a single sitting and was baptized almost immediately. Now, the official history presents what happened next as a missionary journey guided by revelation. The reality looks far more like a calculated operation. In October 1830, Joseph Smith called Parley and 3 others to a mission to the western frontier, officially to preach to the Lamanites, the Native Americans of Book of Mormon theology. 4 men heading into Indian territory. On paper, it was a minor errand for a minor church. But Parley had a target. He insisted the group stop in northeastern Ohio to visit a man he knew personally. Sidney Rigdon, a charismatic Reformed Baptist preacher with a large, organized, devoted congregation in and around Kirtland. If you watched our video on Rigdon, you know him as the architect, the man who may have designed much of Mormon theology. But an architect without a contractor is just a man with drawings. Parley Pratt was the contractor. He knew exactly what Rigdon had been teaching: communal living, the restoration of New Testament Christianity, baptism by immersion, ideas that overlapped almost perfectly with Mormon doctrine. And he knew exactly what Rigdon possessed: infrastructure, meeting houses, a network of followers who already believed most of what Mormonism was selling. This was not a spontaneous stop on a mission trip. This was a hostile takeover of a ready-made religious community. Within weeks, Parley and his companions had converted Sidney Rigdon and roughly 130 of his followers. To understand what that means, consider the numbers. The entire Mormon church at that point had fewer than 200 members, most of them family and neighbors of Joseph Smith, scattered across rural New York and Pennsylvania. In a single stop, a detour Parley himself engineered, he effectively doubled the size of the church overnight and handed Joseph Smith something far more valuable than converts: a functioning community with buildings, social structure, and a respected leader who brought instant local credibility. This was not evangelism. This was acquisition. Rigdon had the blueprint. Parley had the tools, the nerve, and the salesmanship to execute. And together, they changed the trajectory of the entire movement. Within months, Joseph Smith relocated to Ohio. Kirtland became the church's first real headquarters, the site of its first temple, and the operational base for every major expansion that followed. Without Parley's detour, none of that happens. The church stays in New York. It competes with hundreds of similar frontier movements, and like nearly all of them, it disappears. But Parley was not just a recruiter. He was the church's first propagandist, and his masterpiece was a pamphlet called A Voice of Warning, published in 1837. If you have never heard of it, that tells you something about how the modern church handles the legacies of people who become inconvenient. A Voice of Warning was not just a tract. It was the single most important missionary document in 19th century Mormonism. Missionaries carried it for decades. It was translated, reprinted, and distributed across continents. What made it so effective was what Parley left out. The Book of Mormon, taken raw, contained elements that were strange and alienating to mainstream Protestants of the era: ancient American civilizations, golden plates, angels delivering scripture. Parley understood his audience. He took the core message and filtered it through language that a Baptist or a Methodist would find familiar and compelling. He softened the strange. He amplified the resonant. He framed the restoration not as something alien, but as something those readers already believed was necessary. Pratt was the first Mormon apologist, the man who built the filter between the church's actual claims and the version the outside world was allowed to see. The modern missionary discussion, with its careful sequencing of information and its gentle approach to controversial doctrines, has its DNA in that pamphlet. He built the audience. He built the language. He built the system. And almost none of it was assigned to him by revelation. It was initiative, talent, and strategy. The church's early growth was not a miracle. It was a marketing campaign run by a man who understood what people wanted to hear before they knew it themselves. Now, an audience without a theology is a crowd. Someone still had to give the converts a reason to stay that went deeper than charisma and emotion. Someone had to take the scattered, sometimes contradictory revelations of Joseph Smith and turn them into a system that could withstand intellectual scrutiny. That job fell to Parley's younger brother, and what Orson Pratt built would eventually put him on a collision course with the most powerful man in the church. A collision the institution is still trying to pretend never happened. Part 2. The Philosopher. They tried to erase Orson Pratt was 2 years younger than Parley, but in many ways the more remarkable mind. Where Parley ran on instinct and charisma, Orson ran on logic and structure. He was self-taught in mathematics, astronomy, and philosophy, and he brought to Mormonism the one thing it desperately lacked in its early years: intellectual credibility. Baptized in 1830 at the age of 19, Orson almost immediately began doing something no one else in the church was doing. He was not writing testimony. He was not delivering sermons. He was writing theology. Structured, reasoned arguments for why Mormon claims were logically coherent and historically plausible. This mattered more than most people realize. In the 1830s and 1840s, mainstream Protestant ministers attacked Mormonism constantly as ignorant frontier superstition. Joseph Smith was a brilliant religious innovator, but he was not a systematic thinker. His revelations came in bursts, often contradictory, sometimes vague, always shaped by immediate circumstances. Someone needed to take that raw material and forge it into something that could survive a sustained intellectual assault. Orson became that person. His most consequential contribution is also the one the modern church has the most complicated relationship with. In 1840, while serving a mission in Edinburgh, Scotland, Orson published a pamphlet called An Interesting Account of Several Remarkable Visions. This was the first time the story of a teenage Joseph Smith seeing God the Father and Jesus Christ in a grove of trees was presented to the public in a widely distributed, printed format. Pause on that for a moment. The first vision is now considered the foundational event of the entire religion. It is the first story every missionary tells. It is the image on the cover of church publications. It is the event the institution treats as the most important thing that happened in the 19th century. And for the first 10 years of the church's existence, almost nobody talked about it. Joseph Smith did not publish his own account until 1838, and even that version had extremely limited circulation. It was Orson Pratt who took that story, structured it, framed it, and placed it in front of thousands of readers in Britain, the single most productive mission field in early Mormon history. Without Orson's pamphlet, the first vision might have remained a minor anecdote rather than the defining narrative of the faith. He did not just record the story. He decided it was the story, and the church followed his lead, without ever crediting the decision to him. Orson went further. He attempted something genuinely radical for a religious leader in the 19th century. He tried to reconcile faith with science. He published works arguing that the principles of astronomy and mathematics were not only compatible with Mormon cosmology but actually supported it. He proposed that God operated through natural law, not arbitrary miracle. He argued that the universe was governed by intelligible principles that rational inquiry could uncover, and that Mormonism, uniquely among religions, was prepared to embrace that truth. This was intellectually bold, and it was exactly the kind of theology that would make an authoritarian leader very nervous. Because Orson was not building a faith that demanded obedience, he was building a faith that demanded thought. And those two visions of what Mormonism should be were heading toward an explosion. Part 3. Silenced, humiliated, erased. If you have been following this channel, you know the most revealing moments in Mormon history are not the triumphs. They are the fractures. The moments when the official story cracks and you can see the power dynamics underneath. The Pratt brothers provide two of the most important fractures in the entire narrative. Start with Orson, because his story is the one the church has worked hardest to bury. In 1842, Orson Pratt was excommunicated. The official reason was insubordination. The real reason was far more personal and far more damning. While Orson was away on a mission, Joseph Smith made advances toward his wife, Sarah. When Orson returned and learned what had happened, he did not quietly submit. He defended his wife. He confronted the prophet. He questioned Joseph Smith's honesty and integrity on a matter that struck at the most intimate part of his life. And for that act of basic human decency, for choosing his wife over his prophet, Orson Pratt was thrown out of the church he had helped build. He was rebaptized and reinstated within months, but the message had been delivered. Loyalty to the prophet was not negotiable, not when it came to doctrine, not when it came to theology, and not when it came to your own wife. The deeper conflict, however, came later, under Brigham Young, and it was not personal, it was theological. Orson's most famous dispute with Young centered on the Adam God doctrine, Brigham Young's teaching that Adam, the biblical first man, was actually God the Father in a mortal form. Orson rejected this openly. He called it logically incoherent. He argued it contradicted both scripture and reason. And he did this publicly, as a sitting apostle, directly challenging the president of the church on a doctrinal matter. Brigham Young did not simply disagree. He set out to destroy Orson's standing. He rebuked him in meetings. He stripped his seniority in the quorum of the 12 apostles, dropping him to the bottom of the line. And that detail matters more than it appears to, because in the Mormon system, the president of the church is determined by seniority. The longest-serving apostle becomes the next prophet. By sending Orson to the back of the line, Brigham Young did not just punish him for the present. He ensured that Orson Pratt could never become the president of the church. The punishment was not just moral, it was political, and it was permanent. Then came the final humiliation. Young forced Orson to publish a formal retraction of his own theological positions in the Deseret News, the church's official newspaper. Read that again. The man who gave Mormonism its intellectual spine, who published the first vision, who tried to make the faith intellectually respectable, was compelled to publicly disavow his own ideas, in print, under his own name, in the church's own paper. Not because the evidence had changed, not because he had been proven wrong, because power demanded submission, and submission had to be visible. And here is the part that makes this story extraordinary. After Orson died in 1881, the church quietly moved away from the Adam God doctrine. It was allowed to fade. Today, the LDS Church does not teach it. When members ask about it, leadership either dismisses it as speculation or ignores the question entirely. Orson Pratt was right. The doctrine he was humiliated for opposing was abandoned by the very institution that forced him to kneel. His vindication was total and completely silent. No acknowledgement, no apology. No restoration of his theological legacy. His pamphlets were allowed to go out of print. His contributions were folded into the general narrative of early church growth with no special recognition. Now, Parley. His end was different in form but identical in pattern. His relationship with leadership was turbulent throughout his life, fiercely loyal to the cause but never fully under control. His missionary work in England in the early 1840s brought thousands of British converts to Nauvoo, providing the labor and population that kept the church alive during one of its most precarious periods. And yet his legacy ends not in honor, but in blood. In 1857, Parley was murdered in Arkansas by Hector McLean, the estranged husband of Eleanor McLean, a woman Parley had taken as a plural wife. The church sometimes frames this as martyrdom, a faithful apostle killed for his beliefs. The reality is more uncomfortable. It was a crime of passion, caused directly by the practice of plural marriage, that Parley himself had helped normalize and defend. The very doctrine he had validated with his pen and his preaching led to the circumstances of his own death. He was killed not for being a Mormon, but for taking another man's wife under a system he had spent decades promoting. His death happened just weeks before the Mountain Meadows Massacre, another catastrophe the institution spent a century suppressing. Parley's individual contributions were quietly absorbed into the institutional story. The man who engineered the hostile takeover of Kirtland, who wrote the book that built the missionary program, who brought thousands across the Atlantic, became a name on a list and nothing more. The pattern is always the same. Use the talent, discard the person, claim the credit. So let us return to the question, could Mormonism have survived without the Pratt brothers? Without Parley, there is no Kirtland. Without Kirtland, there is no temple, no Rigdon, no financial base, no platform for the British missions. The church remains a tiny sect in New York, competing with hundreds of identical movements, and like almost all of them, it vanishes within a decade. Without Orson, there is no published first vision until years later, no systematic theology, no intellectual defense against the relentless attacks from mainstream Christianity. The faith has passion, but no framework. It has converts, but no arguments to keep them. One brother built the audience, the other built the theology, and the institution they saved rewarded them with humiliation, silence, and erasure. There is a sentence that captures this entire video, and it is one the LDS Church will never say out loud. The modern Mormon Church is, theologically, the Church of Orson Pratt, but operated with the authority of Brigham Young. It inherited Orson's ideas and Brigham's power structure. It kept the philosophy and discarded the philosopher. It used the marketing and erased the marketer. And that tension between the people who build institutions and the leaders who control them is not just a 19th century story. It is the story of the LDS Church today. If this is the first video of ours you have watched, this channel investigates the history the Mormon Church does not want you to know. We covered Sidney Rigdon, the man who may have designed Mormon theology. Today it was the Pratt brothers, the contractor and the philosopher who built the church itself. Subscribe, because we are not done. And if you think this is a story that deserved to be told, send it to someone who is still getting the sanitized version. The truth does not need permission to travel.